For centuries, the Knights Templar have existed in the public imagination as something almost comforting. They are remembered as holy warriors, sworn to poverty, chastity, and obedience, riding beneath white mantles marked with red crosses. In textbooks and popular history, they appear as protectors of pilgrims, guardians of dusty roads leading to Jerusalem, and loyal servants of a medieval church that rewarded faith with purpose. It is a story repeated so often that it feels settled, finished, and safe. Yet even at a distance, the image begins to fracture. These were monks forbidden from bloodshed, who became one of the most lethal fighting forces in Europe. They vowed poverty, yet controlled staggering wealth. They answered only to the Pope, yet operated like a sovereign power, owning land, castles, fleets, and treasuries across continents. No other religious order before or since has ever been granted such freedom, such secrecy, or such authority. The contradictions are usually brushed aside as necessities of war or quirks of medieval politics. But the deeper one looks, the more strained those explanations become. Why did kings kneel before them? Why did the church tolerate an armed force it could not command? And why were the Templars allowed to exist beyond the reach of local law, as if protected by an invisible shield? What if the familiar story was never meant to explain the Templars at all, but to distract from them? What if the image of humble warrior monks was carefully cultivated to conceal a role far more unsettling? Because beneath the armor, the prayers, and the legends lies a silence that historians struggle to fill, and history rarely leaves such silences without reason. That silence whispers that something essential was hidden in plain sight, waiting centuries for the right moment to be questioned by us. On the morning of October 13th, 1307, as church bells rang across France, an order moved with terrifying precision. Knights Templar were seized in their beds, dragged from chapels, arrested in castles, cities, and rural commanderies. No warnings leaked, no defenses were raised. By sunset, the most powerful order in Christendom was broken. Medieval governments were slow, fragmented, and inefficient. Messages traveled on horseback. Coordination took weeks, sometimes months. Yet this operation unfolded simultaneously across an entire kingdom, as if guided by a single, invisible hand. Historians still struggle to explain how King Philip accomplished what should have been impossible. The official explanation claims the king acted suddenly, shocked by rumors of heresy and moral corruption. But the story collapses under scrutiny. Arrest warrants had been prepared in advance. Confessions were anticipated. Torture chambers stood ready. The machinery of destruction was already built long before the first night was seized. This was not panic, it was execution. Such preparation suggests foreknowledge, not suspicion. Philip did not move because he feared the Templars. He moved because he knew exactly where to strike, when to strike, and what he was looking for. Something specific, something urgent. The question that haunts historians is not why the Templars fell, but how the king knew when to act. Secrets powerful enough to justify an unprecedented purge rarely appear overnight. They are uncovered slowly, quietly, through whispers, spies, and stolen documents. So what reached Philip's ears that night? What truth convinced him that delay meant disaster? Because men do not dismantle institutions that protect kings unless those institutions threaten to expose something far more dangerous than swords. And if such knowledge existed, it was not merely political. It cut to belief, authority, and legitimacy itself. The speed of the arrests suggests fear, not greed. fear that the Templars carried a truth capable of collapsing thrones and altars alike if even a single knight was allowed to speak. That possibility lingers unanswered, hovering over that night like a shadow history has never fully escaped. Still, its presence can be felt whenever the Templars are remembered today. Modern historians are quick to reassure us the charges leveled against the Knights Templar, they say, were inventions, political weapons forged by a desperate king drowning in debt. Accusations of heresy, idol worship, obscene rituals, and secret oaths are treated as medieval paranoia, extracted under torture and therefore meaningless. In academic circles, the case is considered closed. But history is rarely that clean. The problem is not that the accusations were false. The problem is that they were too specific to be pure fantasy. Across hundreds of interrogations, separated by distance and time, the same strange details surfaced again and again. The same denials of the cross, the same references to hidden knowledge, the same whispers of a head, an idol, a symbol that defied easy explanation. Torture can force screams, but it struggles to invent consistent stories. When patterns appear, historians grow uncomfortable because patterns suggest a source, something shared, something practiced. So the question shifts from whether the Templars were innocent to something far more dangerous. What if the accusations were not lies, but distortions? What if sacred rituals were misunderstood by outsiders or deliberately reframed to sound monstrous? What if heresy was simply the church's word for beliefs it could not control? The medieval world punished heresy brutally, but it rarely erased entire institutions. Orders were reformed, leaders were replaced, scandals were buried, yet the Templars were annihilated down to their name, their symbols, and their memory. That level of destruction suggests fear, not correction. If the goal was justice, the process failed. If the goal was silence, it succeeded perfectly, which forces us towards a question historians hesitate to ask because it destabilizes comfortable conclusions. What secret could provoke such absolute erasure? What belief, discovery, or knowledge was so dangerous that it demanded not reform, but obliteration? Because whatever the Templars carried did not merely threaten power, it threatened the story Christianity told about itself. And if it survived at all, it survived quietly, encoded in silence, waiting for centuries until someone brave enough dared to listen again once more. When the First Crusade ended, Jerusalem was less a holy city than a wounded one. Its streets were scarred by violence, its population fractured, its sacred spaces claimed and reclaimed by competing powers. To medieval Christians, however, Jerusalem was not merely conquered ground. It was the center of the world, the point where heaven and earth were believed to touch. Every stone carried memory. Every ruin whispered scripture. It was here, in this tense and unstable city, the Knights Templar quietly took root. Officially, their purpose was simple: protect pilgrims traveling through hostile territory. But their chosen headquarters tells a far stranger story. They did not establish themselves near city gates or along dangerous roads. Instead, they settled directly on the Temple Mount, beneath the ruins of what was believed to be Solomon's temple. This location was not just sacred, it was forbidden. Layered beneath it were centuries of destruction, rebuilding, and buried tradition. Jewish scripture described the site as the dwelling place of divine presence. Islamic tradition revered it as holy ground. For Christians, it marked the spiritual foundation of their faith. Yet no one truly knew what lay beneath its surface. The Templars were granted access where others were denied. They lived, worked, and excavated in a place wrapped in taboo and legend. Chroniclers say little about what they did there, only that they remained for years, largely unseen. The silence surrounding their early days is unsettling, because history is usually loud when something important is happening. Here it is quiet, almost deliberately so. Jerusalem after the Crusades was a city of tension and belief, but also of opportunity. And beneath its most sacred ground, the Templars found something worth protecting long before they ever protected pilgrims. The early years of the Knights Templar present one of the most baffling gaps in medieval history. According to official records, the order consisted of only 9 knights, 9 men tasked with defending thousands of pilgrims across hundreds of miles of hostile land. The mathematics alone make the mission absurd. For nearly a decade, these knights fought no recorded battles. They escorted no caravans, they patrolled no roads. There are no heroic accounts of ambushes or defenses, no praise for victories, no tales of sacrifice. Instead, there is silence, a silence made stranger by the fact that these men were armed, funded, and protected by the highest authorities in Christendom. So what were they doing? Historians have offered explanations that feel more like excuses. Some suggest they were preparing. Others claim records were lost. But preparation does not take 10 years, and medieval chroniclers were meticulous when it came to acts of faith and violence. The absence of detail suggests that whatever occupied the Templars was not meant for public knowledge. The most unsettling possibility is that they were never meant to be soldiers at all. Not at first. Beneath the Temple Mount, these 9 knights had access to underground chambers, collapsed passageways, and sealed ruins untouched for centuries. They had time, protection, and secrecy. The conditions of an excavation, not a military operation. 9 men working quietly beneath the most symbolically charged site in Christianity raises a disturbing question. If they were not guarding pilgrims, then who were they guarding knowledge from? And if they found something, why did their power and influence explode only after those silent years had passed? History remembers the Templars as warriors, but their story begins not with swords drawn in battle, but with men descending into darkness, searching where no one else was allowed to look. Legends rush in to fill the silence left by history. Some claim the Templars were searching for the Ark of the Covenant, the sacred chest said to house divine power itself. Others speak of lost treasures of Solomon, relics of unimaginable wealth and authority. These stories are often dismissed as fantasy, yet they persist for a reason. More unsettling are whispers of texts, ancient scrolls, forgotten gospels, writings that did not align with the version of Christianity endorsed by Rome. If such documents existed beneath the Temple Mount, they would not merely challenge church doctrine, they would undermine its foundation. Early Christianity was not unified. Competing beliefs about Jesus, divinity, and salvation existed for centuries before orthodoxy was enforced. Many of those beliefs were erased, their texts destroyed or buried. What if some survived, hidden deliberately in the ruins of the temple? What if the Templars found them? Knowledge is more dangerous than treasure. Gold can be stolen, power can be challenged. But an idea, once revealed, cannot be taken back. If the Templars uncovered evidence that Christianity had been reshaped, edited, or controlled, their loyalty to Rome would become impossible. This possibility reframes everything that follows. Their sudden rise in wealth, their independence from kings, their immunity from law, These were not rewards for faith, but safeguards for silence. Because if they found something beneath the Temple Mount, it was not meant to enrich them. It was meant to be protected. And perhaps the most terrifying thought of all is this: whatever they uncovered was powerful enough that centuries later, we are still asking what it was. What knowledge could rewrite Christianity itself? And why was it buried where only a few would ever dare to search? To the modern mind, Solomon's temple is imagined as a grand religious building, a sacred structure meant for prayer, sacrifice, and ceremony. Yet ancient Jewish texts describe something far more complex. The temple was not simply a house of worship. It was a model of the universe itself, constructed according to precise mathematical ratios believed to mirror cosmic order. Every measurement carried meaning: the placement of chambers, the alignment of entrances. Even the materials used were governed by sacred geometry. These designs were not symbolic decoration, they were instructions. Ancient traditions speak of the temple as a mechanism through which divine knowledge could be accessed, a place where heaven and earth were deliberately aligned. Esoteric writings go further, describing the temple as a conduit, a machine that amplified spiritual perception. Wisdom, prophecy, and enlightenment were not gifts granted freely, but states unlocked through understanding structure and law. To enter the temple unprepared was dangerous. To misuse its knowledge was catastrophic. If these descriptions are even partially true, then Solomon's temple was not destroyed simply to erase a building. It was dismantled to bury a system of understanding that could bypass religious authority entirely. And if fragments of that system survived underground, hidden beneath centuries of rubble, they would represent knowledge older and possibly more powerful than Christianity itself. Christianity did not emerge fully formed. In its earliest centuries, it existed as a collection of competing ideas, interpretations, and teachings. Some portrayed Jesus as a divine sacrifice meant to be worshipped. Others described him as a teacher who offered hidden knowledge, urging followers to awaken rather than obey. These alternative perspectives were preserved in texts later labeled apocryphal or heretical. The Gnostic Gospels spoke of inner illumination, personal discovery, and spiritual equality. They described salvation as understanding, not submission. To the emerging church, such ideas were intolerable. Power depends on control of narrative. A faith built on obedience cannot survive teachings that empower individuals to question authority. So these texts were hunted, burned, and buried. Councils were convened to define orthodoxy, and anything that deviated was erased from official memory. Yet erasure is never perfect. Some writings vanished into deserts, caves, and forgotten vaults. If the Templars excavated beneath the Temple Mount, they may have encountered remnants of these suppressed traditions. Texts that presented Jesus not as a distant God, but as a guide toward forbidden knowledge. Discovering such writings would not merely challenge church doctrine, it would expose it as selective history. If Jesus taught enlightenment rather than submission, the consequences are devastating. The authority of Rome rests on mediation, on the belief that salvation flows through institution, hierarchy, and ritual. Remove that necessity, and the entire structure collapses. The church understood this danger well. That is why heresy was punished so severely, not because it offended God, but because it threatened control. Knowledge that frees the individual is always more dangerous than armies. If the Templars learned that Christianity had been reshaped edited, and enforced through suppression, their role as defenders of the faith would be fundamentally altered. They would no longer serve the church. They would stand apart from it, guardians of a truth, too destabilizing to reveal. This possibility explains the fear, the silence, and the eventual destruction that followed them. It reframes their secrecy, not as rebellion, but as preservation. And it leaves us with a question that still unsettles historians and believers alike. Did the Knights Templar uncover evidence that Christianity was built not on revelation, but on what was deliberately hidden from the world? When the Knights Templar were first recognized by the church, they took vows that bordered on extreme even by medieval standards. Poverty was central to their identity. They owned nothing as individuals. They ate simple food, wore unadorned clothing, and lived under strict discipline. Contemporary accounts describe them sharing horses, armor, and even beds. Nothing about their early lifestyle suggested future wealth. And yet, within a single generation, the Templars became one of the richest and most powerful institutions in Europe. This transformation happened with unsettling speed. They began receiving donations of land, castles, and entire villages from nobles seeking spiritual favor or political alliance. But land alone does not explain what followed. The Templars developed a financial system unlike anything medieval Europe had seen. Pilgrims could deposit money in one country and withdraw it safely in another using coded documents. Kings entrusted them with treasuries. Popes relied on them to move enormous sums across borders. In effect, the Templars invented modern banking centuries ahead of its time. No other monastic order demonstrated this level of financial sophistication. There were no known precedents, no gradual evolution. The knowledge appeared fully formed, efficient, and controlled. It raises an uncomfortable question. Where did this expertise come from? Monks were not trained as financiers. Knights were not educated in accounting. Yet the Templars operated with precision that rivaled later Renaissance institutions. Poverty may have been their vow, but wealth became their reality, and the speed of that change suggests it was not accidental. 4.2 Money doesn't explain everything. Even vast wealth fails to explain the true reach of the Knights Templar. Gold can buy influence, but it cannot erase laws. Yet the Templars existed beyond legal boundaries that constrained every other institution of the age. They answered to no king, no bishop, no local authority. Only the Pope could command them, and even that authority was limited. They paid no taxes. Their properties were immune from seizure. Their members could not be tried in secular courts. In practical terms, the Templars functioned as a sovereign power embedded within Europe itself. The kings borrowed from them heavily, placing entire realms in their debt. This reversed the natural order of medieval power. Rulers who were meant to command instead negotiated carefully, aware that angering the Templars could collapse their finances overnight. Such privileges were unprecedented. The church rarely tolerated independent power, especially armed power. Yet the Templars were granted freedoms that contradicted centuries of doctrine. This was not generosity, it was necessity. Something made the Templars untouchable. Money alone does not inspire fear. It provokes envy, theft, or war. But fear leads to hesitation, compromise, and secrecy. The deference shown to the Templars suggests that their value extended far beyond their treasury. They possessed leverage, not merely resources, and leverage implies knowledge, knowledge that others lacked, knowledge that others feared would be exposed if pressure was applied too aggressively. 4.3 Par rooted in knowledge, not gold. When King Philip IV finally moved against the Templars, it was not because he wanted their gold. That explanation collapses under scrutiny. Confiscated wealth did not solve his financial problems. Much of it vanished. Some was never found at all. More importantly, if greed were the motive, destruction would have been unnecessary. Control would have sufficed. Instead, Philip chose annihilation. This decision makes sense only if the Templars represented a threat that could not be contained. A threat rooted not in armies or treasuries, but in what they knew. Kings do not fear wealthy men nearly as much as they fear men who can expose inconvenient truths. If the Templars possessed knowledge capable of undermining religious authority, political legitimacy, or both, their independence becomes understandable. Their privileges were not rewards, they were safeguards. Silence was purchased through immunity, and when silence could no longer be guaranteed, force replaced negotiation. This reframes the Templars' entire rise. Their banking system, their influence, their autonomy were tools, not goals. Tools designed to protect something far more valuable than gold, something that could not be deposited, transferred, or seized. So the final question of this chapter lingers uncomfortably. What truth gave the Knights Templar leverage not just over kings, but over the church itself? And why was that truth considered more dangerous than open war? Among all accusations leveled against the Knights Templar, none is more enduring or more misunderstood than the charge of idol worship. Under interrogation, some Templars spoke of a figure called Baphomet, a name that would later become synonymous with demonic imagery. To medieval ears, this accusation alone was enough to justify execution, yet the description of Baphomet was never consistent. Some claimed it was a head, others described a face with multiple features. A few spoke of a symbol rather than an object. These contradictions have long been cited as proof that the confessions were fabricated. But contradictions can also emerge when witnesses struggle to describe something symbolic rather than literal. In esoteric traditions, the head represents knowledge, consciousness, and wisdom. Balance between opposites, light and dark, masculine and feminine, was often expressed through composite imagery. What later generations interpreted as demonic may originally have symbolized unity, enlightenment, or hidden truth. The word Baphomet itself may be a corruption, possibly derived from Greek or Arabic terms associated with wisdom or prophecy. If so, the idol was never a demon at all, but a misunderstood emblem of forbidden theology. A symbol dangerous not because it opposed God, but because it redefined how God could be understood. One of the most shocking accusations against the Templars was that new initiates were ordered to spit on the cross or deny Christ during secret ceremonies. To medieval Christians, this was unthinkable. Modern historians dismiss the claim as torture-induced slander, yet it refuses to disappear from the historical record. The difficulty lies in motivation. These were men who endured brutal campaigns, starvation, and death in the name of their faith. Why would such individuals secretly mock the symbol they publicly defended with their lives? Unless the act was not a rejection of Christ, but a rejection of something else entirely. Some scholars suggest the ritual was symbolic, designed to strip away blind obedience. By desecrating the symbol, the initiate was forced to confront belief beyond image and authority. In this interpretation, the act was not blasphemy, but discipline, a reminder that truth did not reside in objects, institutions, or imposed rituals. Early Christian mysticism often warned against idolizing symbols over understanding meaning. If the Templars encountered suppressed teachings that emphasized inner knowledge over external worship, such rituals would make grim sense. They were not denying Christ. They were rejecting what the church had turned him into. Seen this way, the ritual becomes less an act of heresy and more an act of defiance, carefully hidden beneath layers of secrecy. When viewed together, the accusations against the Templars begin to form a different pattern: idol worship, denial of the cross, secret ceremonies conducted away from public eyes. Taken literally, they describe corruption. Taken symbolically, they suggest preservation. If the Templars believed the church had altered Christianity to consolidate power, then secrecy was survival. Symbols replaced words. Rituals replaced doctrine. Meaning was concealed behind acts designed to repel outsiders and confuse enemies. Heresy, in this context, becomes a label applied by authority to anything it cannot control. The church did not need the accusations to be true. It only needed them to be believable. The destruction of the Templars was not about punishing sin. It was about silencing a parallel understanding of faith, one that bypassed Rome, questioned hierarchy, and placed knowledge above obedience. This interpretation transforms the charges from absurd lies into distorted reflections of something real, something Rome could not allow to spread. And so the chapter ends with a question that still unsettles scholars and believers alike. What if the Knights Templar were not betraying Christ at all? What if they believed Rome had already done so long before swords were ever drawn? When the arrests of the Knights Templar began, Pope Clement I was not the architect of their downfall. In fact, the earliest records show hesitation, even resistance. Clement was no warrior pope, but he was deeply aware of church law, and by that law, the accusations against the Templars were weak, inconsistent, and unproven. More importantly, the Templars answered directly to him. An attack on them was an attack on papal authority itself. At first, Clement demanded proper investigation. He ordered that the knights be placed under church custody, not royal chains. He questioned the legality of Philip's actions and warned against rushing judgment. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that the Templars might survive. Then the pressure began to mount. Philip IV was relentless. He controlled armies, courts, and territory the Pope depended on for protection. France surrounded Clement geographically and politically. The papacy itself was vulnerable, and Philip knew it. Accusations were repeated louder, more publicly. Confessions extracted under torture were paraded as proof. Silence became complicity. Clement's reversal was sudden and unsettling. The same pope who questioned the charges now sanctioned trials. The defender became the executor. Historians often describe this as weakness, but weakness alone does not explain the decision. Clement did not simply abandon the Templars, he buried them. Such a reversal suggests fear, not fear of Philip alone, but fear of what might be uncovered if the investigation continued too deeply. The Pope stood at a crossroads between truth and survival, and the path he chose still haunts the Church today. For centuries, the official narrative held that the Church condemned the Templars as heretics. That certainty collapsed in 2001 when a forgotten document surfaced in the Vatican archives. Known as the Chinon Parchment, it revealed something extraordinary. Pope Clement V had secretly absolved the leaders of the Knights Templar. The parchment records private hearings in which senior Templars confessed, repented, and were formally forgiven by the Pope. Heresy, the gravest charge against them, was lifted. According to church law, absolution should have ended the matter. The order should have been reformed, not destroyed, yet nothing changed. Publicly, the trials continued, executions proceeded, the order was dissolved, its name erased. The contradiction is staggering. The church forgave the Templars in secret while allowing their annihilation in public. Why absolve men you believe to be heretics? Why erase an order you know to be innocent? The only answer that fits the evidence is that guilt was never the issue. The problem was not what the Templars had done, but what they knew. Absolution addressed sin. It did nothing to neutralize dangerous knowledge. The Chinon Parchment exposes a church trapped by its own fear. Clement could forgive the men, but he could not allow their legacy to survive. Whatever truth they carried could not be debated, reformed, or redeemed. It had to disappear. The destruction of the Knights Templar was not justice. It was containment. The church did not act because the Templars were guilty of heresy, but because they were custodians of something destabilizing, something that threatened the foundations of authority itself. If the Templars had merely broken rules, discipline would have sufficed. If they had committed crimes, punishment would have been measured. Instead, their identity was erased, their symbols forbidden, their history distorted. Institutions do not behave this way unless they are afraid. The church survived schisms, wars, and revolutions, but knowledge that bypasses mediation is uniquely dangerous. If faith could exist without hierarchy, without Rome, without control, the church would become optional. That possibility was intolerable. So Clement chose silence over truth, survival over revelation. In doing so, he ensured that whatever secret the Templars carried would remain unspoken, sealed beneath layers of condemnation and myth. And yet, the very extremity of the response suggests how powerful that secret must have been. Powerful enough to terrify kings, powerful enough to corner a pope, powerful enough that even forgiveness was not enough. Which leaves us with a final, chilling question. What truth frightened the church so deeply that it chose to silence God rather than risk letting that truth be known? On a cold evening in March 1314, Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, stood bound to a wooden stake on an island in the Seine. He was an old man by then, worn by years of imprisonment, interrogation, and betrayal. The charges against him had already been decided. The sentence was death. What remained was silence. Instead, de Molay spoke. Eyewitnesses recorded that as the flames began to rise, he called out to God, declaring his innocence and the innocence of his order. Then his words shifted, turning from defense to judgment. He summoned King Philip IV and Pope Clement IX to face divine justice within a year, not someday, not in eternity, soon in a medieval world steeped in belief. Such words carried weight. Curses were not metaphorical. They were feared as real forces, especially when spoken by a man condemned unjustly. De Molay did not beg for mercy. He issued a sentence of his own. What followed unsettled even hardened chroniclers. Pope Clement V died just weeks later, struck down by illness. King Philip IV followed before the year's end, his reign ending suddenly and violently. To believers, the curse was fulfilled. To skeptics, coincidence offered a safer explanation. Yet, coincidences rarely arrive so precisely timed, and history rarely remembers final words unless they resonate. De Molay's death was meant to close a chapter. Instead, it opened a wound that never truly healed. The deaths of Philip and Clement did not restore the Knights Templar, but the consequences of their destruction rippled outward, destabilizing the very institutions that ordered it. Philip's heirs struggled to hold power. His dynasty collapsed within a generation. France entered a long period of instability, famine, and unrest. Some historians dismiss the idea of a curse, yet they cannot ignore the pattern that followed. The centralized authority Philip sought to strengthen began to fracture. Trust between crown and people eroded. Over centuries, resentment hardened into revolution. The French monarchy that once crushed the Templars would itself be dismantled in fire and blood. Heads would fall, symbols would be destroyed, sacred authority would be questioned openly. The parallels are difficult to ignore. To those who believe in the curse, this was not vengeance, but consequence, a punishment for silencing truth, a debt collected slowly across generations. Even those who reject the supernatural sense that something fundamental broke when the Templars were erased. An institution built on secrecy destroyed another institution built on secrecy, and in doing so, it set forces in motion it could never fully control. Whether curse or coincidence, the fall of the Templars marked the beginning of an end. Not immediately, not visibly, but inevitably. Power taken through fear rarely remains stable for long. Jacques de Molay's execution was intended as a warning. Instead, it became a symbol. The church and crown sought obedience through fire, yet what they created was martyrdom. De Molay died proclaiming innocence, not repentance. His refusal to submit reshaped how the Templars would be remembered. This raises a haunting possibility. What if the Templars understood their fate long before it arrived? What if resistance was never the goal? Secrecy, after all, only works if it survives destruction. If the knowledge they carried could not be revealed safely, then sacrifice may have been the final act of protection. A message encoded not in words, but in consequence. A warning that silencing truth carries a cost. De Molay's death ensured the mystery would endure. It transformed the Templars from defeated knights into symbols of forbidden knowledge, symbols that outlive their enemies. So the question remains, unanswered and unsettling. Was Jacques de Molay merely a victim of political cruelty? Or did he and his order choose martyrdom to preserve a secret too dangerous to speak aloud? If so, the flames that consumed him were not an ending, but a signal sent forward in time, still waiting to be understood. After the arrests began, the official record insists the Knights Templar were rounded up completely, their order neatly dismantled by royal decree. Yet the documents do not match the reality on the ground. Entire commanderies were found empty. Ships registered to the Templars vanished from Mediterranean ports days before the arrests. Fortresses that should have held knights instead held silence. Medieval bureaucracies were obsessive record keepers, especially when property was involved. Land seizures were catalogued, names were listed, assets were tracked. But when it came to the Templars, gaps appeared. Men named in warrants were never found. Others disappeared between arrest and trial. Some were recorded as fugitives, but no pursuit followed. The most troubling detail is timing. The arrests were coordinated, but not perfect. Word traveled. Some Templars clearly knew what was coming. They did not fight. They did not flee in panic. They evacuated with precision. Treasuries were emptied. Archives vanished. What remained looked staged, as if abandonment itself was part of a plan. This was not the behavior of an order caught by surprise. It was the behavior of an organization executing contingency. Whatever the Templars feared losing, they secured first. Gold may have been taken, but knowledge leaves no inventory. History tells us the Templars were destroyed. Evidence suggests something else. The institution died, but the people did not vanish. They went underground into anonymity, into other identities. And whatever they carried with them was important enough to disappear for centuries rather than risk exposure in a single moment. In that disappearance lies the first proof that the Templar story does not end in ashes, but continues in silence, moving through history unseen, waiting for conditions where survival mattered more than remembrance, and protecting truths that could not yet be spoken aloud without consequence by anyone. One of the most persistent legends surrounding the Knights Templar is that they did not vanish entirely, but re-emerged in altered form. The most commonly cited refuge is Scotland, a land politically hostile to the Pope and quietly sympathetic to enemies of Rome. When Templars fled, Scotland offered something rare in medieval Europe: protection without questions. Centuries later, another institution emerged bearing strange similarities. Freemasonry spoke in symbols, guarded secrets through initiation, and valued knowledge over obedience. Its rituals referenced builders, geometry, and sacred design, echoing descriptions once associated with Solomon's temple. Officially, there is no connection. Historically, the overlap is unsettling. Freemasonry appears fully formed, with complex structure and symbolism that seems to arrive without clear origin. Like the Templars, it emphasized fraternity, secrecy, and moral enlightenment independent of church authority. Knowledge was transmitted through allegory, not doctrine. Meaning was concealed from outsiders by design. This method solves a problem the Templars would have faced after their destruction. Spoken truths could be hunted. Written texts could be burned. But symbols survive persecution. They can be misunderstood, dismissed as decorative, or preserved without comprehension. If the Templars carried forbidden knowledge, encoding it into ritual and architecture would ensure survival across centuries. The message would remain intact, but inaccessible to those lacking the key. In this form, the secret does not challenge authority directly. It waits. Whether Freemasonry inherited Templar knowledge or simply adopted similar strategies, the pattern is clear. The secret was not erased. It was transformed into something that could endure hostility, forgetfulness, and time itself. This transformation allowed dangerous ideas to move invisibly through generations, carried by stories, gestures, and architecture rather than proclamations. It ensured survival without confrontation, influence without exposure. In that sense, secrecy became not weakness but strategy, allowing knowledge to outlast institutions designed to destroy it. Long after names faded and orders fell, the code remained intact, patient, waiting for curious minds to recognize patterns hidden in plain sight, where meaning survives persecution by becoming invisible rather than confrontational, and thus passes safely through eras of fear and suppression without ever fully disappearing entirely. If the Templars hid their knowledge, traces of it may still surround us. Medieval cathedrals rise across Europe with mathematical precision that feels deliberate, almost instructional. Ratios repeat, alignments mirror stars. Geometry encodes meaning beyond aesthetics. To most observers, these features are artistic achievements. To initiates, symbols speak. Labyrinths carved into stone floors guide inward journeys. Pillars reflect duality. Light enters sanctuaries at precise moments of the year, marking cosmic cycles rather than liturgical ones. Symbols function as language. They compress complex ideas into form. Those without context see decoration. Those with knowledge read instruction. This method protects information by hiding it openly where only understanding unlocks significance. Templar crosses vary subtly, hinting at layered meaning. Architectural anomalies appear where none should exist. Even burial practices suggest alignment with principles older than Christianity. None of this proves intention alone, but together it suggests continuity. If knowledge survived, it did not do so as doctrine. It survived as pattern, as repetition, as structure embedded into stone, ritual, and tradition. These are the safest vessels for forbidden ideas, because they do not announce themselves. Perhaps the Templar secret was never meant to be revealed dramatically. Perhaps it was designed to be rediscovered slowly by those willing to look without fear. In that sense, the message still waits, encoded all around us, asking the same question it always has. Who is ready to see it? And if that is true, then history itself becomes a kind of test, not of belief, but of perception. The symbols do not force revelation. They invite it. They reward patience, humility, and curiosity. Those qualities, perhaps, were the true initiation all along, separating followers from thinkers, obedience from understanding, comfort from truth. In this way, the Templar legacy survives without ever declaring itself, embedded in the world like a quiet question that refuses to disappear. It lingers wherever stone meets sky, where geometry becomes prayer, and where seekers choose wonder over certainty long after empires fall and doctrines harden into unchallenged authority, leaving only traces for those willing to question inherited truths and listen beyond history itself. After the fall of the Knights Templar, Christianity did not fracture overnight. There were no public declarations, no dramatic rewrites of doctrine announced from pulpits across Europe. Instead, the change was subtle, gradual, and almost invisible unless one knows where to look. Before the 14th century, Christian practice still contained traces of mysticism. Monastic tradition spoke of direct experience with the divine. Visionaries, contemplatives, and mystics were tolerated, sometimes even revered. Faith was not only about obedience, but about transformation. After the Templars vanished, that balance shifted. Mystical movements were increasingly scrutinized. Teachings that emphasized inner revelation were quietly discouraged or reclassified as dangerous. The language of faith hardened. God became more distant, mediated through rigid hierarchy rather than personal encounter. Mystery was replaced with certainty, and certainty was enforced through doctrine. This was not coincidence. Institutions threatened by hidden knowledge respond by narrowing acceptable belief. Ambiguity becomes risk. Questioning becomes rebellion. The church that emerged from the Templar era was more centralized, more cautious, and far less tolerant of interpretations it could not control. Nothing was officially erased, yet something essential was lost. Christianity became safer, more orderly, and less curious. And that transformation began precisely when an order accused of guarding forbidden knowledge was removed from history. As centuries passed, the church's relationship with knowledge grew increasingly defensive. Scripture was locked behind language barriers, inaccessible to common believers. Interpretation became the exclusive domain of clergy. Questioning authority was reframed as questioning God himself. This was a reversal of early Christian spirit. The faith that once spread through dialogue, debate, and discovery now spread through instruction and obedience. Salvation was no longer something explored, but something administered. Heresy hunts intensified. Movements emphasizing personal understanding or spiritual autonomy were crushed. The message was clear. Truth flowed downward, never upward. To seek independently was to invite suspicion. This environment makes sense only if knowledge itself was seen as dangerous. Not ignorance, but understanding. not disbelief, but insight. Institutions do not fear ignorance. They fear those who can see through constructed narratives. If the Templars had uncovered evidence that Christianity had been shaped through suppression, then the church's reaction becomes tragically logical. Control was no longer optional, it was survival. Faith became less about awakening and more about alignment, less about inner truth and more about external conformity. This version of Christianity proved remarkably durable, but it came at a cost. The mystery that once invited seekers inward was replaced by rules designed to keep them in place. Fear leaves fingerprints on everything it touches. In religion, it manifests as rigidity, intolerance, and silence around uncomfortable questions. After the Templars, Christianity did not lose power, it lost confidence. A faith secure in truth does not fear inquiry. A faith built on suppression does. If dangerous knowledge once existed, then reshaping belief was not an act of faith, but of defense. The church that emerged was strong, unified, and authoritative, but also guarded, cautious, and resistant to change. This raises a disturbing possibility. What if modern Christianity is not the pure continuation of early faith, but the result of centuries spent protecting itself from a truth it could not destroy? What if doctrine hardened not to preserve revelation, but to prevent rediscovery? If so, the absence of the Templars did not end their influence. It fulfilled it. Their silence shaped belief more profoundly than their words ever could have. And that leaves us with an unsettling thought. If Christianity changed quietly once before, shaped by fear of what was known, then the question is not whether it can change again. The question is whether humanity is ready to confront what was hidden the first time. The story of the Knights Templar refuses to fade, not because of swords or treasure, but because the questions they left behind remain unanswered. Centuries have passed, yet the same institutions that once crushed the order still grow uneasy when the conversation turns too curious, too speculative, too close to foundations. That discomfort alone is telling. Modern archives remain sealed, documents surface slowly, selectively, as if history itself is being rationed. Scholars who dig too deeply are often dismissed as conspiratorial, not because their questions are absurd, but because they are inconvenient. The Templars occupy a strange place in memory, officially resolved yet perpetually controversial. If their story were simply one of corruption and greed, it would have lost its power long ago. Instead, it persists because it hints at something unresolved, something structural, something that still matters. Every era fears certain questions that challenge authority, identity, and belief. The Templar mystery survives because it asks whether truth can be institutionalized at all, or whether it inevitably escapes containment. That question remains as relevant now as it was in the 14th century, perhaps more so. Some truths are too destabilizing to announce publicly. They are not erased because erasure draws attention. Instead, they are buried beneath layers of distraction, reinterpretation, and time, forgotten not by accident, but by design. If the Templars uncovered knowledge that challenged the foundations of faith, the safest way to neutralize it was never to debate it. Debate invites curiosity, silence suffocates it. History shows this pattern again and again. Dangerous ideas are not always destroyed, they are delayed, locked away until the world changes enough to survive them, until belief matures into understanding or fear loosens its grip on power. Perhaps the Templars understood this. Perhaps secrecy was not cowardice, but patience, a recognition that truth revealed too early becomes martyrdom rather than transformation. If so, then the secret was never meant for medieval Europe, or even for us. It was meant for a future capable of confronting uncertainty without violence. And that raises a sobering thought. If the knowledge still lies buried, it may be because humanity is still not ready to face it without turning on itself. The Knights Templar were erased, but the silence they left behind continues to speak. It asks a question that has no comfortable answer, only consequences. If the Templars were right, then faith has been shaped by fear, authority by suppression, history by selective memory, belief by what was hidden rather than what was revealed. If they were wrong, then an innocent order was destroyed to protect power, and the truth died screaming in flames along the Seine. Either possibility is unsettling, because if they were right, then everything we believe rests on a foundation we have never been allowed to examine. And if they were wrong, then history teaches us how easily fear can masquerade as righteousness. The most disturbing possibility is that we may never know which is true. Perhaps that is the final legacy of the Knights Templar. Not answers, but an invitation to question inherited certainty, to look beyond official stories, and to accept that truth is rarely comfortable. If the Templars were right, the question is no longer what they believed. The question is what we are prepared to believe now, knowing what they may have died protecting.